Hey folks, how's it going? Thanks for checking out the video. Today I'm going to look at a method for deploying a Power BI dataset using Azure Dev Ops. So, first of all, a bit of an apology. This video covers a very niche use case. I'd say probably 90% of Power BI developers, this probably isn't going to be of interest. However, if you do fit some of the criteria I'm going to go through here, you should definitely stay tuned. So, some of the things that this video is going to deal with. First of all, it's about deploying a Power BI dataset via an XMLA endpoint. Now, write access to an XMLA endpoint is a feature that was first made available last year.
Yay!
But it is a Power BI premium feature.
Boo!
Now that can be premium per user or premium capacity. And whilst I don't have much experience with it, I do believe that also means you can deploy to the XMLA endpoint for Power BI embedded SKU too. The next thing is, this really isn't for people that are developing using Power BI Desktop. The assumption here will be that you're using Tabular Editor for developing the dataset. That can be Tabular Editor 2 or Tabular Editor 3. I'm also going to assume that you're source controlling your dataset using a Git repository. I don't plan to cover how to set up a Git repo or how source control works. You're also going to need an Azure Dev Ops environment, and you're going to need to set up a Power BI service principal. Again, I don't plan to go into how to actually set up that service principal. What I can do is point in the direction of GynaCube, who have a really good video on how to do this already. I will of course include a link for you in this, and also I'll make sure that that link's in the description too. This method is specifically about how to use a service connection to facilitate that deployment. Using a service connection means you don't have to store connection string credentials in DevOps. Finally, in order for this to work, you're going to need an Azure subscription, because that service connection needs an Azure subscription to be associated with. Now, a word of warning, as a Power BI developer, you might not actually have all of the access to set this up. I'm using my own Power BI tenant, for which I have full admin rights. I've also been able to set up my own Azure subscription on my own DevOps environment. So I've got full privileges. If you work in a larger organisation, you might find that some of that infrastructure is locked down, in which case you might need to approach somebody else in your IT team to help you set this up, in which case, show them this video. This video is largely inspired by a series of blog posts made by Daniel Ticker, the guy who invented Tabular Editor. The blog series was called You're Deploying It Wrong and is available via the Tabular Editor website. It's a few years old now and was originally aimed at developers of SQL analysis services. However, with the availability of read-write XMLA endpoints in Power BI last year, a lot of this blog series is now applicable to working with Power BI Premium. Of course, I'll provide a link in the description. I'll be focusing on creating a deployment pipeline using DevOps, and there's one particular sentence from Daniel's blog that I'd like to draw attention to. That's this sentence here. If you don't like to store credentials within Azure DevOps, it should be possible to use an Azure Resource Manager service connection to impersonate a service principal during pipeline execution. Now that's exactly the scenario that I found myself in. I was working with a client where we didn't want to keep those credentials in DevOps. However, Daniel's blog doesn't actually cover the technique to use that service connection, so I had to figure it out for myself. Firstly, you're going to need a Power BI service principal setting up. As already mentioned, you should follow along with the Guy in the Cube video to find out how to do that. I have mine set up here. Now there are a few pieces of information about your service principal that you need to take a note of. Firstly, you need to take note of the application ID. This is sometimes called a client ID. You also need to make a note of the tenant ID, or as it's labelled here, directory ID. And the other thing you're going to need to know is the client secret. So you create a client secret using this option on the left hand side. I've created one here already and called it PBI DevOps Pipeline. The secret value is only visible when you create it, so make sure you record that somewhere safe. I created this one earlier, which is why it's currently obfuscated. Now what you'll also need to do is associate this service principal with an Azure resource group. If I go to my Azure homepage, I've got a resource group set up here. And we give that service principal access using the access control option. Now the service principal doesn't need to have a high level of access to the resource group. You should use the principle of least privilege. And in this case, I suggest just giving reader access to that service principal. It doesn't need to have access to actually create and manage resources, just needs to be able to read the resource group. Now there are a few bits of admin that you're going to have to do inside the Power BI service as well. I'm here in the admin portal. And we need to scroll down to the developer settings and choose this option that allows service principals to use Power BI APIs. This needs to be enabled, and then we need to choose who to apply it to. Now we can't give the service principal direct access to this, you have to specify a security group. However, what you can do is you can create a security group in Azure AD and then add your service principal as a member of that security group. So in my case, that SP PBI service principal that I've created already is a member of this security group, PBI_admin_API. So firstly, you need to make sure that's set up. Next, you need to make sure that you've granted read-write access to the XMLA endpoint. Now I'm using premium per user for this example. So I'm going to come over to this option on the left-hand side. And you'll see down here, I've set the XMLA endpoint to read-write. Now the last bit of admin I need to do in Power BI is go to the workspace that I'm going to be deploying my dataset to. So I've got an empty workspace here called DevOps Pipeline. I need to make sure that my service principal has got access to this workspace. So if I go over to access, you'll see I've added the service principal here already. Again, using that principle of least privilege, this service principal doesn't need to have full admin access on the workspace. The method we're going to use works absolutely fine if you just give contributor access, so it doesn't need to be admin or member, contributor works fine. So with all of that background setup out of the way, we can finally dive into Azure DevOps. I've set up a project here, Power BI DevOps Pipeline. Let's click into there. And the first thing I'm going to do is set up that service connection. So down here to project settings in the bottom left hand corner, select service connections. I'm going to create service connection. The type of connection we want is an Azure Resource Manager. Now the recommendation here is the automatic setup. If you use that option, what Azure will try and do is set up a brand new service principal for you, and it will often give it some wacky name. What I think is a much better option is to specify the service principal that we've already got set up. So I'm going to suggest you use the manual option and click next. So now we need to fill out these details on the right hand side. So it is an Azure cloud environment. The scope level is subscription. You'll need the subscription ID from your Azure subscription. This is a pay-as-you-go sub. So, service principal ID. This is the piece of information that is labelled as app ID or sometimes client ID when you actually look at the service principal. So if you made a note of that information earlier, put that in here now. The credential we're going to pass is a service principal key. That actually means the client's secret. So again, you should have made a note of that earlier. When we paste that in there, we can see it's obfuscated. That's basically the password effectively for the service principal. We need the tenant ID here as well. Can verify that. We can see the verification succeeded, so we've connected up that service principal successfully. So let's give it a name. And we can verify and save. So the service connection is now set up. Now let's go take a quick look at my Git repository. So within the repo, I've got a tabular model uploaded. Now you could source control this as a .bin file, which is the file format for a tabular model. But my preference is to use the Save to a Folder Structure option in Tabular Editor. What that does is it breaks down all the objects within your tabular model into separate JSON files. So we have a top level definition of the tabular model in this database.json file. And then for each separate table, we have a set of files that defines that table. So top level definition of our calendar table, and then separate files and JSON objects for each column. Let's create a pipeline to deploy this tabular model. So we come to pipelines on the left hand side, and then we select create pipeline. Now I'm going to do this the old style way using the classic editor. The reason for this is that this is the technique that's used in Daniel Ettiker's blog, and it's the method that I'm familiar with. I find it easier going through that classic editor to add steps to our pipeline one by one. Now using these methods, there are two parts. We create a build pipeline that compiles our code into an artifact, and then the second part is to create a release pipeline that then publishes that artifact to the Power BI service. So from this screen, we're going to select Use Classic Editor. The first step is to associate the pipeline with a Git repository. Now, strictly speaking, what you can do is you don't have to use a Git repository that's actually in Azure Dev Ops. Perhaps you use GitHub for source control or Bitbucket or something along those lines. So you can separate out the pipeline from the source control if you wish. In this example, my Git repo is in Azure Dev Ops anyway, so it's defaulted to the correct repo. So this is my project, this is my repository, and we're setting this up for our main branch. So let's hit continue. We're going to select an empty job here, and then we're going to actually set up our agent. So we can give a name to the pipeline here. I'm just going to use the default. For the agent pool, I am going to use Azure pipelines. You can, of course, if you have this set up, use your own self-hosted pipeline if you prefer. The agent specification, I always stick to Windows latest. And then what we need to do is to add some steps to our agent job. So first step to add, what we actually need to do is download Tabular Editor onto our build agent. That's done using a PowerShell script. Once we add that to our agent job, we need to configure it. Let's give the task a new name. And we're going to run the script inline. And we need to paste our PowerShell script here. I've lifted this script directly from Daniel Ettiker's blog. Let's add our second task, which is that we want to run a command line task. I'm going to rename the task to something descriptive. Here we're going to build our tabular model. And we add our script here. We're telling our build agent to launch Tabular Editor from the version that we've just installed. Then we're going to open our database.json file. And then here, the B is telling it to build the solution and then save it as this model.bim file. So we've built the artifacts that we want to deploy. What we need to do is add one last task to publish it. And there's no need to do any configuration on this step if you don't want to. The defaults work absolutely fine. So that's all the tasks that I need for this build pipeline. Just one other thing that I want to do is I want to set a trigger. So I come to the triggers option at the top, and I want this to be a CI/CD pipeline. So that's continuous integration and continuous deployment. So I want to enable continuous integration, and I'm basically saying here that whenever somebody makes a commit to my main branch, I want this build pipeline to be triggered. So with that build pipeline set up, I can save it. And the next thing I need to do is create my release pipeline. So far, the steps I've used are pretty much identical to those that are used in Daniel Ettiker's blog. Although I set up that service connection earlier on in the video, I haven't actually used it. All of the tasks that have taken part so far have happened within the realms of DevOps. So my code was already in DevOps. The fact that I've built an artifact using that code and then published it to a staging area ready to be deployed still all happens inside of DevOps, and so the service connection as yet hasn't been used. However, we're going to change things up slightly when it comes to the release pipeline. So again, select new pipeline. And I'm going to go with an empty job again. Let's give our release pipeline a meaningful name. And the first thing I want to do is add an artifact. So click over here. It's going to default to the project that I'm in. And the source is going to be the build pipeline that I've just set up. Literally we're saying basically based on my build pipeline, grabbing the most latest version that's been published. So I can add that artifact there. Again here, I want to set up a continuous deployment trigger. So what we're saying here is that every time a new build is available in this pipeline, trigger my deployment. And now we want to add some tasks to our deployment. So click into this stage. You can rename the stage if you want. And select the agent job. Again, we might want to set this up. We're going to use Azure pipelines, and I'm happy to use the Windows latest. And now let's add some tasks. Now, much like the build pipeline, the first task we need to add to our release pipeline is again to download Tabular Editor onto our build agent. Our build pipeline and our release pipeline might end up running on different machines, so we need to make sure we download it again. However, this time we are going to use the service connection. And to do that, rather than using a regular PowerShell task, we're going to use an Azure PowerShell task. Let's rename this again. Now the Azure PowerShell task has a few additional items we need to configure. In the Azure subscription, we actually want to select our service connection. Again, we're going to be an inline script. The script itself is exactly the same as before. And I'm just going to use the latest installed version of PowerShell. So that's step one sorted, download Tabular Editor again. Step two is again going to be a command line task, but again, because we want to use our service connection, the task type we actually need is Azure CLI. Give that a new name again. Again, specify the service connection. Our script type is going to be batch, and the script location again is going to be inline script. This is the script we need to run this time. So let's talk you through it. So firstly, launch Tabular Editor and load up this .model.bim file. That's the artifact that we created in the last step. Next, we have this D command. That's instructing Tabular Editor to deploy the file. Now there are two pieces of information that deployment command needs: a connection string and a target database. Now if I go back and look at the blog that we've been referring to, you'll see this is the version of the script here. Launch Tabular Editor, load up the file we want to deploy, and in Daniel's script he passes the entire connection string as one variable and then the target database name as a second variable. If I go and take a look at the Microsoft documentation on using service principals with the XMLA endpoint, we can look at what the definition for the connection string actually is. And we can see it's broken down into various parts. So we need to pass the data source, which is the workspace that we're going to be connecting to. We also need to include a user ID and a password. The format for the user ID is to pass the app ID separated by an @sign and then the tenant ID for your service principal, and the password is your service principal secret. So in the script I'm going to use for deployment, rather than passing that connection string as one big variable, I'm going to break it down into its constituent parts so we can parameterize it a little bit more. First of all, you'll see in the data source, I've set a variable for PBI workspace. So that's a pipeline variable. So I set this up here in the variables tab. I'm going to call it PBI workspace, and I need to pass it my XMLA connection string here. Now I can get that from my workspace in the Power BI service. So back here in my DevOps pipeline workspace, I'm going to go to the settings, and I'm going to go to the premium tab, and you see down here workspace connection. So let's copy that back to DevOps. And I can paste that value here. There's one really big gotcha with this. When you copy and paste that out of the Power BI service, it replaces any white space with the %20 for the spaces. You need to get rid of those. If you keep those in, when you try and do this deployment, it fails and says it doesn't recognize the workspace. So if you do have spaces in the name of your workspace, make sure you remove those. Okay, back to my tasks. So I've given the data source and my connection string. Now I need to give the user ID and the password. Now you may notice here the syntax looks a little bit different. So there's some variables here being passed that are in between these percentage signs. I've got the service principal ID, the tenant ID and the service principal key, which is what I need for my connection string. But they're not using pipeline variables. Now what I need to do here, if I scroll down the page a bit to the advanced section, there's an option here, access service principal details in script. What I want to do is I want to tick that, and if we look at this information box, we see a little bit more information. So what we can do, using our service connection, we can actually reach in and grab the service principal ID, service principal key and the tenant ID and pass those directly into the script. They're exactly the credentials we need to form our connection string. Now we've configured this as a batch script, so you'll see in this section here, this is the correct syntax that we need to be able to use. Basically we are allowing even though we don't have these credentials stored inside DevOps, we're allowing that service connection to utilize the details for the service principal to enable that connection string to our Power BI XMLA endpoint for this dataset. The last part of the script is this argument here, which is basically where we are specifying our target database. So again, this is a pipeline variable that I've called PBI dataset. So when I say we need to tell it the target database, what I really mean is that we are telling it the name of the Power BI dataset we want to publish to. So again, I need another pipeline variable. That's PBI dataset. Let's call this my PBI. And that should now be everything set up for our pipeline to run. So let's hit save again. Let's see if we can run this pipeline end to end. So I'm going to go back to my pipelines tab. I'm going to select the build pipeline that we created earlier, and I'm going to hit run pipeline. So we are wanting to take the code from our main branch and run this. And what I can do if I want is I can select my agent job and I can see the steps run as they go. And once you see that agent job is successfully completed, we can go to our releases. We can see that release has automatically been triggered. If we click into that release, again we can follow along and see each of the steps in action. And we can see our release is now successful. If I navigate back to my workspace in Power BI and hit refresh, you'll see magically my PBI dataset has now been deployed. So it's worth mentioning here that all we've deployed is the structure of the dataset. There's no data actually in this at this point in time. So the first thing you're going to want to do is refresh it, and instantly you're going to get an error message. And if we look at the details in the error message, it's because we are missing credentials. So first thing we're going to need to do is go into the settings. Firstly, we can see up here, this dataset has been configured by our service principal, but that service principal is unable to authenticate the credentials. So I'm going to take over, and the credentials are refreshed now. So back to my workspace, and should now be able to refresh this. It's worth pointing out you should only have to validate those credentials the first time you deploy the dataset. If you are deploying changes after that first deployment, it should be okay after that. However, I do recommend after each deployment that you do a dataset refresh, especially if you are adding new tables or new columns into your dataset. Because you're just deploying the structure, not the actual data itself, you'll need to run the refresh to make sure you get any new data in to populate those new fields.
2,000 years later.
Okay, so probably should have chosen a smaller data set to demonstrate with so that refreshed quicker, but my refresh is now done. So let's very quickly create a little rudimentary report just to demonstrate that's now got data in it. Unit quantity in a card. So 66 million sales unit quantity. And you can see my data model is now populated. So what I thought would be a good thing to show you is the end-to-end process for using a CI/CD pipeline. So I have cloned my repository from DevOps onto my laptop, and I've got Tabular Editor 2 open here. So this is where I've downloaded my code to, and if I open my database.json file, my tabular model is loaded here. I'm very fortunate that at work they pay for me to have a Tabular Editor 3 license. I absolutely love Tabular Editor 3. I'm recording this using my personal laptop, so today we're going to be summing it with Tabular Editor 2. Tabular Editor folks, if you fancy giving me a nice little sponsorship, a bit of a Tabular Editor 3 license for demonstration purposes, reach out. In the meantime, let's get back to Tabular Editor. So here's my model. For argument's sake, let's make a change to that sales unit quantity measure that we had before. Let's make it a little bit bigger. And just for silliness sake, we're going to put a multiplier in there so that whatever our sales quantity is gets multiplied by 2 at the end. And I'm going to save that change back to my model. Now, as it stands, Tabular Editor, definitely Tabular Editor 2, doesn't have a built-in source control interface. So my recommendation is to use GitHub Desktop. So I've got GitHub Desktop open here. It's detected I've made a change. It's highlighted what the change is. So you can see that it's removed this line and added a line with a multiplier in it. And what I can do is I can commit that change to my local repository. And then I can push that change up to the remote version. So that's pushing it actually up to DevOps. This is pretty naughty. In the real world, don't do it like this. I absolutely advocate you should have a proper branching strategy. So really what you should do is create a feature branch from your main branch to develop that in, and then have a pull request that pulls that into main branch. I'd also recommend setting up policies on your branches so that people can't commit directly to main. But this is just a demo, so we can be a little bit wild, wild west. Now if I navigate back to DevOps, we'll see that me committing to my main branch has now triggered a build. And when that build succeeds, we'll see that we've triggered a release. And we can see that once that release succeeds, if we navigate back to our report in Power BI, the sales unit quantity is the measure that we've just deployed a change to. So if I hit refresh, I can see that although the data in my model hasn't changed, because the definition of my metric has, this figure's now doubled. So that's continuous integration and deployment in action. There's more cool stuff that you can do with these deployment pipelines. For example, here in my build pipeline, I've added a step to run Best Practice Analyzer. I keep a copy of my Best Practice Analyzer rules in the source control for my tabular model. So this command line script runs the analyzer. What that means, if I push a version of my tabular model and have a look at my build pipeline, we'll see the build pipeline's been triggered. And you'll see here this step failed. In this instance, it gives me warnings for all my best practice rules that have got a severity of 2. But if I hit a best practice rule that's got a severity of 3, so in this example, I've created a DAX expression that has got the table name in it, which I shouldn't do. It throws an error and it stops the model being deployed. So you can put a step in there that stops bad code being deployed to your solution. Another nifty thing you can do is add extra steps in your deployment script as well. In this version of my deploy dataset, I've added some extra steps before the deployment happens. These first 2 lines in the script are some C# that are going to change my data source connections. I can plug this part of my script into some pipeline variables to hot swap the connection string that the Power BI model is going to use to connect to a source database. That could be really, really useful if you're using your pipeline to move between different environments. So for example, you've done your development work pointing at a development database, and when you promote this into production, you actually want it to point at your production data. Now there are definitely some ways that the technique I've showed you today could be improved. Firstly, I wonder whether or not it is possible to call an API at the end of the deployment to maybe set those credentials rather than having to validate them manually. And the other thing that I'd like to experiment with is whether or not there's a way to trigger a dataset refresh automatically. So rather than having to worry about refreshing your dataset manually once you've done the deployment, could DevOps trigger that for you? These are a couple of ideas that I haven't had a chance to play around with yet. The other thing I'd really like to do is change this into a YAML pipeline. YAML pipelines are a more modern way of executing pipelines in DevOps. And they work really well because you can actually source control the code behind the YAML alongside the code for your actual project, which then means you can easily deploy that YAML pipeline across other projects. Now, even when you use the classic editor, you can see the YAML that's being generated. So this gives you an idea of how you might be able to create a YAML pipeline. But personally, I'm not quite there yet in terms of understanding how you can parameterize those YAML pipelines more effectively and make them reusable. Maybe you might like to give it a go. If this method is something that you're looking to implement, to help you along, I've put all the little snippets of code that we use within the pipeline onto a GitHub repository. As always, I will provide a link to that repository in the description. I hope that's been useful. Maybe you can let me know whether or not you end up using this deployment technique, or even better, reach out and let me know if you've come up with a way that you can improve this version. As always, if you do have any questions or feedback, please do use that comment section below. If you've enjoyed today's video, please do give it a thumbs up. And if you'd like to follow along for more Power BI content from me, please subscribe to the channel. Thanks once again for watching, and I'll see you next time.